Welcome to devMode.fm, a podcast dedicated to the tools, techniques, and technologies used in modern web development. I'm Andrew Welch from NY Studio 107.
I'm Patrick Harrington from Mildly Geeky in Boston.
I'm Michael Rogg from Top Shelf Craft in Texas.
And today we have on the man, the myth, the legend from Pixel and Tonic, Brandon Kelly.
Hello.
Hey.
How you doing, Brandon? And we got you on here because you released a little something called Craft 3.2, correct?
Certainly did.
So if you were out doing summer sled dog stuff, you messed up my rhythm. All right. If you were out doing summer
do you write these ahead of time? Like, do you have just like a random unrelated words generator?
I assume he's just cycling through like Mad Libs from junior high or something like that.
If you were out doing sled dog racing in the middle of summer in Ketchikan, Alaska, and someone mushed up alongside of you and said, "Hey, Brandon, what's new in Craft 3.2?" What would you tell them?
Bonus for correct use of the word mush.
I didn't even know that word.
Come on, man. The dogs are getting tired.
Yeah. They'd probably love to hear about Headless Live Preview.
All right. Tell us. What is Headless Live Preview?
Well, it's actually the reason for most of the features in Craft 3.2 is we wanted to achieve Headless Live Preview. We've started hearing from a lot of people that they've found themselves wanting to do more with Headless, and the thing holding them back from that was that, you know, it didn't have the live preview support for Headless single page apps and stuff like that.
Yeah, well, let's tell everyone what headless means, because we transitioned right from sled dogs to headless, and people might be getting a little worried. So what does it mean to have a headless CMS? Like, what is that?
Yeah, and that's like, I don't even know. That seems like a phrase that maybe is going out of fashion, but the idea of a headless CMS would be like a CMS that isn't traditional CMS in that it doesn't have any kind of templating component to it, or at least you're not using it. So like a traditional website built with Craft would be something that, you know, where you're actually not only managing your content with Craft, but you're also using the Twig templating system. And then your website is literally being driven by Craft. Request goes in to Craft. Craft serves up the template and responds to it based on, you know, whatever template logic you've added to it and injecting your content into that.
So the real point here is that the thing that is managing the content is not also then rendering the page. And I mean, I've heard.
Yeah. So if you're using Craft as a headless CMS or you're using any other headless CMS, then the request is hitting something else. It's hitting some kind of Vue app or React or whatever. And that's sending its own AJAX request off to the CMS. CMS gives it back, you know, the content, and then it populates the page with the content that way.
I've heard all sorts of terms about this. I've heard like renderless CMS. I've heard content API. Like, what are the other kind of trendy terms that people are starting to use instead of headless that you've heard?
I don't know. Like, headless still seems to be the thing that people would call it, but
yeah. It's so morbid.
I've seen I don't know how representative of like the general population this is, but I know like at least in Dean Barker's world, you guys subscribe to Squirrel Notes, you know, he's been hearing mumblings of, you know, people don't like the concept headless because it implies that it's missing something as opposed to just more focused.
Sure.
And in Craft's case, it's awkward because it does have a head, you know, it does have this whole templating engine, and it's head optional. So I don't know what the right
no heads required
here.
I've kind of taken to calling this sort of thing like a decoupled CMS.
Okay.
Which is, I don't know, not that much more helpful, but
yeah, I mean, it's still the same problem. Like you have the
guess.
option, it's decouple optional, you know.
Yeah. But I guess it sort of points to the trend that what we conceptualize as a website is kind of getting a lot more broad and a lot more complex than it was a few years ago, when a CMS just cared about rearranging some things from a database and spitting out HTML that was going to get consumed by a browser. Like, now there's so many more ways to consume quote unquote content. You know, it may be a web page, or it may be something totally different. It may be the Alexa on your desk, or a podcast app on your phone, or whatever. And so it kind of cleans up the job of the CMS if the job of the CMS only has to be managing the content, and something else is consuming the content and sorting it into whatever its final form is going to be.
And that's kind of always been the reality, as long as Craft has been a thing, is that there's always been mobile apps and there's, other ways that the content could be consumed besides the website. So we've always built Craft in a way where like the content is the content, and templating was always kind of thought of as this separate component of Craft that you could easily, forego if you didn't need it. And it seems like now we're kind of getting to this point where, in addition to the content being consumed by other things like mobile apps and whatnot, now the entire website is also consuming the content in a different way. So it's kind of coming, to the point where future versions of Craft are just going to go further and further in this direction of like Craft is really focused on the content management and making that distinction more clear. And it has this templating component if you need it, but it's not the way that we're assuming you're going to be building sites.
Yeah, because if you think about it, just the name content management system doesn't really imply that it's going to be rendering web pages. It implies that it's managing content. And I think the reason why we backed into having CMSs render content is there was no other real way to do it back when CMS started being a thing, right?
Yeah, for sure.
Yeah. So,
and it's still enough of a big use case, right? Like, it makes sense for Craft to do image transforms, even though I'm not using Craft to transform my images, but enough people still are that it makes sense for it to do it, but it's also not, strictly speaking, content management work.
Yeah, sure. And that's one of those things where Craft needs image transforms itself for image thumbnails and stuff like that within the, to create the control panel experience. So, that's I don't think we're ever going to ship a version of Craft that doesn't have Twig, because there's parts of the control panel. Well, currently most of the control panel UI is rendered in Twig, but even when that goes away, we're still using Twig for stuff like entry URI formats and title formats, and anything in the control panel where you can kind of create this template that defines other values. If you're using the pre-parse field, for example, by Andre Elvin, you're going to be using Twig to generate some value that may not have nothing to do with HTML.
Sure.
But just as a way to kind of pre-render combined field values and stuff like that.
Yeah, I mean, for sure. Templating languages have tons of uses beyond just rendering an HTML page, for sure.
Right. And so as long as we had a reason to have Twig within the control panel, we'll still ship it with Twig. There's no harm in just having this layer be an optional layer for you to use on the front end.
So you're committing to Twig. We're not going to have a compatibility build of Craft and then Twig goes away down the line.
Yeah, no, I don't think so.
All right, good. That was a deep cut.
So if Craft 3.1 could be considered the project config release, to some extent, that was kind of the big thing. I guess we could consider Craft 3.2 to be the headless preview release. Would that be fair?
Yeah, I mean, there's so much more as far as what the author is going to see, but Headless Live Preview is certainly the inspiration for everything.
Mm-hmm. And
the trick with
so much around drafts to me is
and even that that was all in service of Headless Live Preview. So basically, we got all these requests for it, and the trick was, Live Preview as it worked before was basically as you're typing, Craft is sending post requests off to its rendering engine. It takes the post data, it populates an entry in memory, and then it passes that entry back to the template, and the template then renders the entry page just as if the entry had come from the database, not being, not really caring where it came from. But that doesn't work if Craft isn't the thing that's rendering the page in the first place, which is the case on these single page apps and whatnot. So basically, the way to make it work was we needed to kind of shift the way Live Preview worked to be more of a draft type of system, where as you're typing, we're not posting that data to a Live Preview page, we're posting it to a draft save request. And the draft is just constantly getting updated with whatever you're typing. And then Live Preview at that point just becomes a plain old GET request saying, hey, give me this entry. Here's a token that tells you I get to access this draft you're working on. And then that request could be anything. It doesn't have to be the same. It doesn't have to be a page that Craft is running. It could be a single page app, and then that page app, that thing extracts the token from the query string and forwards it on to the element API request or whatever it is. And as long as whatever request ultimately hits Craft has that token, then Craft is going to inject that draft content into the response. So that's kind of the reason we went to this whole draft auto-saving workflow. It's the reason we introduced preview targets, where you can kind of customize which URLs are available to be live previewed. Because before, if you got live preview, it was only because you were editing an entry that belonged to a section that said it had URLs, and Craft was kind of managing the URLs for that entry, which again is usually not the case for single page apps. There would not really be any reason to add a URI format to a section that's only going to be consumed by some single page app. So we needed to add that whole like preview context thing so you could enter custom URLs as well. And
so just to make it clear for folks that are listening, so the preview target, so we're used to, if I got a blog and I hit live preview, I get a preview of the blog page, right? But with preview targets, you could do something like you could preview the blog page, and then you could also switch to the blog index page and you could preview that with your new entry on it, right? And you can have as many of these things as you want.
Correct. So you could, if you had an archive page, you want to show the blog index page, maybe there's a version, maybe there's like a snippet of the most recent entry that shows up on your homepage as well. So maybe you include that. You can kind of, just put whatever you want in there. Including, pages that aren't actually run by Craft, going back to the original point.
In retrospect, it seems like such a much more crafty way to handle this. Like it seems like the way it was before certainly was the most common use case, but now we've arrived at the way it always wanted to be in the spirit of Craft.
Sure.
And sort of the atomic structured way that Craft stores data. Like it seems like this feature has kind of found its true essence now, which I think is cool.
I think you're right. And maybe to paint a more clear picture here, like the original live preview implementation happened over the course of about 2 hours, about 2 days before Craft 1.0 was released on a whim. It was kind of one of those moments where I was just sitting on the couch, and all of a sudden had this realization, I don't know where my brain was at the time, but I had this random realization, hey, I bet we could implement that live preview feature we've been thinking about. Just, it occurred to me at the moment, how we could do it in a really simple way just to get it in there. It's something we'd wanted to be doing. It was on the to-do list for a while, but weren't really sure how we were going to build it. And it was kind of this last minute, light bulb moment where I realized there was this really simple way we could get it implemented for now, but it was never implemented originally in a this is definitely the right way to do it.
Yeah, because back when we interviewed you on devMode episode number 1, I mean, one of the things you told us about was one of the main motivations for you wanting to make your own CMS is you were using another CMS at the time, looked into
live preview.
Yeah, you wanted a live preview, and you're like, they really need to build a whole CMS for this to actually work.
Yeah,
and then you're just on your couch, and you're like, the whole reason why I built this thing, maybe I should implement it.
Yeah, well, it was it was probably a constant thing I was thinking about at the time, but we didn't actually, up until a couple days before 1.0 launch, we didn't actually have a plan on how to do it, and we were just assuming it's something we would tackle later. Mm-hmm. So it was kind of a nice light bulb moment of hey, here's a quick way to get it in now. But again, it was never, up until now, to Michael Rogg's point, it was never implemented in what's the right way to do this up until Craft 3.2.
And to go along with all of this, as you mentioned, you had to implement the entry drafts. So you also have an autosave built into it now, right? Where just kind of as you're going along, it will automatically save this thing for you?
Yeah, that's kind of the whole system. Yeah. So even if you're not editing a draft, when you go to an entry and you start typing, it'll create a draft for you automatically. And then it'll start auto-saving to that draft.
Yeah. And this leads to my favorite feature, and I'm probably the only one that this is going to be my favorite feature that's in Craft 3.2. But you add... No. Tons of people are going to love that.
That's definitely my favorite feature.
Yeah. So we'll get to that. But no, the fact that there's a max revisions config setting. So I go in, whenever it's mostly for my own sites. Every time I create a new section, I turn the versioning off, right? because it just grows. It grows and grows and grows, and there's no cap. And then you would have to set up a cron task to go in there and and empty it out and all that kind of stuff. But now, because you've got the auto saving in there, you probably needed to have some kind of an upper bounds on this stuff. So now I can set max revisions, and it'll only save the last 5 if I want, and automatically empty the other ones out.
That's correct. Each time you add a new revision, it'll ensure that their total number of revisions is within that number.
Yes. What's the default?
And that's something that's been a feature request forever.
Yeah.
And kind of along the same spirit as this live preview enhancements, the draft system in Craft was never meant to be the long-term draft system. That was another thing that was kind of coded quickly, actually on a plane ride to a conference where we were going to initially demo blocks at the time.
You seem to do everything on a plane, Brandon.
Yeah, it's everything happens before some kind of event, whether it's a release or or an event or all the fun stuff happens right then and there.
It's the combination of adrenaline and uninterruptibility.
And yeah, and to the adrenaline's point, yeah, you're right. Like it's because like right before you're showing something off in a demo or you're releasing something, that's the moment we're going to get all these eyeballs, right?
Right.
And so I think that kind of inspires you to like push a little bit further. Like, what's one more thing we can get in that would just be really cool? And it's the best time to do it too, because by that point, usually all the big stuff is kind of wrapped up, and you've got some time to kill before you actually release it or you demo it. So
yeah, and the shoddy internet doesn't hurt. Just not being bothered as much because everything is a little bit more painful to do. I've always found I'm productive on a plane, but yeah. Unless
I need to run a composer update.
Yeah, or npm install. Yeah.
Then it's
for
bad.
me, it's especially like I'm a real big guy, and so like if it's relatively affordable, I will always opt for first class if I can. Like if it's within.
Andrew is chuckling at that remark.
If it's within a few $100, and so that's the other side of it too. Is if I can score on a relatively cheap first class ticket, then I feel like, okay, well, I'm giving myself this extra comfort so my knees don't hurt at the end of the flight. But what do I owe to the company to justify this extra expense? And so you gotta get the laptop out and make sure you're working as much as you can on that flight.
Are we talking about those fancy like little egg pods, when you're flying international?
No, I've never done that.
Well, it's actually really funny. So I went on a trip and the kids were with us, and I managed to get myself and my kids and also my wife upgraded to first class for that flight. But we also had her sister and brother-in-law and their kids, right? Shows you the personality. One kid was just like, oh, I feel bad. I really want to bring them up here with me. And the other kid was just like, this is awesome. Sucks for you. Anyway, let's get back to features that people actually care about. So, my personal one, I really wanted that Max version. So I think that's fantastic. But you mentioned something about element index pagination. So, Brandon, is it true? Was this release codenamed Masuga?
There was certainly some Masuga influence in this release between the pagination and the entry count next to it.
Ooh. So tell us, how does it work now? So the way it used to work is you had this infinite scroll thing. So you'd go to a section, and if you had 1,000 entries, you would just have to scroll down, right, to see more.
Right.
And now what is the change? How does it work now?
It's just pretty much traditional pagination now. Each page is 50 entries or elements, whatever element you're looking at. The reason we've not done it until now is because we have a better idea. And in fact, it's like especially when you consider structure sections or category groups where you have to show this hierarchy.
Right.
Pagination does not work well in those scenarios because you can't see what the parent is now because it's on the previous page. You can't really drag between things because they're on the previous page. And we couldn't come up with a good UI for that. So we, our grand idea eventually we want to get to is you go to the page and you actually get a scroll bar that's equivalent to what it's going to be if all entries were loaded, right? And then basically just lazy load in whatever entries you're currently scrolled to. Mm-hmm. So if you wanted to jump to the bottom, you could just move that scroll bar down to the bottom and Craft starts pulling in those bottom entries right then and there. So that's kind of like our grand, eventually we want to get to that. Probably won't happen until we switch the whole control panel over to a view app or something.
Right.
And have a good opportunity to really switch things up. And so in the interim, structure sections and category groups, when you're viewing it by the hierarchy, you do still get that same lazy loading, 50 entries at a time UI. But since we're not going to get around to the grand vision for, probably another couple of years, it made sense. We kind of relented at some point and decided we might as well at least get pagination in for everything else that wasn't necessarily holding us back.
And this 50, this number of entries per page, is that a config setting somewhere or is that hard code?
It's not right now. No one's ever asked about it, so...
All right.
Masuga. Like typing.
Yeah, waiting to happen.
If you're listening, Masuga, go ahead and file an issue on the
Yeah, it's the same number we lazy loaded before and continue to in the structure sections and whatnot. So we just kind of went with that again for entries. We could maybe move it to 100 or add some kind of drop down. How many, choose the number. I don't know.
I haven't looked. Is it just using Craft's paginate tag?
It sort of is. A recent Craft 3.1 update sort of moved most of the paginate tags logic to a different class, to a new, like, I think it's actually called paginate class or something. So the same core logic that paginate tags use is being used here as well.
Very cool. And, we've got a number of other pretty cool features that have been added in here. I was actually surprised at the number of, and some of them are small, but they actually make a really big difference. So one example was you can actually sort the element index by custom fields, which I think that's fantastic. Like, there's so many cases where I've wanted to be able to sort by something other than some of the built-in schema fields, and I've been unable to do it.
You always could, but you had to hit the little hook to add a sortable attribute.
If someone implemented
for a while
that
would do it. Yeah.
Right.
Yeah, it was one of those things that people have been asking for. I mean, like, we've got like 700 or 900 issues, like feature requests on GitHub. So there's a million little things like that we could get to at any point. And so, each release, whenever we have time to kill, we'll just look through and try and find some of that low hanging fruit and get it in there. So in this case, that one won out this time. It was a quick change. We had to add a new interface called, I think, sortable element interface sortable field interface that field types that are sortable need to implement now.
Right.
Once they add that implements sortable field interface at the top of the class, then they become sortable. And we kind of needed to do that because you wouldn't necessarily want to sort by like a plain text field or, matrix field, where I don't even know where you'd start with that one. It kind of only makes sense for things like drop down and checkbox and, things where there's an obvious list of possible values.
Yeah, and another quality of life improvement that I think a lot of people that are used to, or part of their business is making sites that have either multi-site or multi-locales, is multi-site element queries, right? So now you can query elements across multiple sites in one query, right?
Yes. Yeah, the story there was Craft 3.1 added this new setting to sections called it's a checkbox. It says propagate entries across all sites. Mm-hmm. And you could opt into it or not. But basically, when you save an entry in that section, whether that entry ends up getting saved across all of the section sites or just the one that you saved the entry in was kind of determined by the value of that setting. So as of Craft 3.1, we started seeing more people obviously doing that, taking advantage of the setting where now they could create sections that are enabled for multiple sites, but whose entries are always only going to be in either site A or site B, but not both. And then someone pointed out, when they do this, it's not really possible to create a search that looks at all sites and kind of, scores the entries in one batch, in one go across multiple sites. And that was kind of a pretty good argument for why we needed some way within the element query parameters to say, I want you to look across all sites, not just one.
Yeah, now you just do .site and you can put in either one ID or an array of IDs, right?
Yeah, so the site parameters for handles, so you could pass one or multiple handles, or you could just add an asterisk, and then that'll basically say across all the sites.
Right.
And then there's also a site ID parameter that's the same thing, but for IDs.
Got it. Yeah, sorry.
Also supports the asterisk.
Yeah.
And then there's a couple other parameters that we added alongside that. Like, once you're querying across multiple sites, then like what happens if you do have an element that exists across multiple sites that's enabled for, saved to 3 different sites? Do you want all 3 of those back? In some cases you might, because maybe you want to create like a quick little navigation, jump to this entry in the other sites, drop down. Right. And so you just want to say like graph.entries.id is whatever the current entry ID is, .site ID is asterisk. .all or .site ID is every site but the one that we're looking at, and then create that drop down. So in that case, you would want these kind of duplicate responses back just with different sites. But in other cases, like a search, you might want to extract any duplicate entries. You might just want all the unique entries. And so the default behavior is that you get everything, and there's a new unique parameter called unique, which will ensure that you're only getting one entry or one unique, or each entry is unique in the results. And then there's a third parameter we added called prefer sites, and that kind of lets you determine what the order of preferential treatment the site should get when there are duplicates that exist.
Yeah.
So
that's the real kicker for me. For when I use this feature, the ability to prefer a current site or something,
you
is going to be
and
killer.
the default behavior is that you'll always get the current site back first if that does exist. But there's cases, I think, where you might always want to specify, here's the exact order of sites that I want back. Go with the entry in site A if it's there, go with entry in site B if it's not an A, etc.
Yeah, super dope. I love that.
Localization's fun.
Yeah, when I think about all of the time that I spent trying to get like a language switcher between elements working properly,
It's easier now.
Thanks, Brandon.
Yeah, it's easier now. And actually, it's one of those things where the amount of work for multi-site element queries was maybe a couple days, maybe 2 or 3 days, and to get it all right.
Well, 2 or 3 Brandon days, right? The Brandon days are like dog years, What Brandon does in 2 or 3 days is what we do in 2 or 3 weeks, okay?
It was one of those things, though. Once I was done and I started going through the code base, there were so many spots where I got to drastically clean up the code base thanks to multi-site element queries that I was kicking myself by the end of it. Why the hell didn't we just do this to begin with? All of these times, it didn't even, the thought didn't even cross my mind. Hey, I've been doing this stupid hack 10 times. Why don't I just solve this at the element query level? It didn't even occur to me until after it was done.
That is one of my favorite parts of programming. Is when I'm going in there and I'm just tearing stuff out. I'm like, God, I was an idiot. Why am I? I can make this so much better. I love that. I don't know what it is, but there's something about that I find really appealing. And probably it's a similar character trait, like people that really enjoy landscaping and pulling out weeds and stuff like that. You know what I mean?
Yeah. I mean, that is kind of how you end up thinking about it. I mean, there is code that does just feel like that. It didn't feel good to write it to begin with, and it feels great to delete it.
Exactly. Exactly. You've got I have the same thing. You got this slight revulsion when you're writing it, and you're just like, but it's good enough.
Yeah, gets the job done.
Yeah.
But I also think that is the mark of a good programmer, or that I'm making progress in my programming, is if things that I wrote 2 weeks ago just look awful to me now. And I'm like, God, what was 2 weeks ago?
How quickly are you learning?
Yeah,
what was 2 weeks ago, Michael, thinking? What an idiot.
I need a year.
But then it feels good.
Michael, you may need 2 weeks, but I need a year. If I look at something I did a year ago and think it sucks, then I'll be like, all right, I'm learning on this. That's good. But 2 weeks, man? Wow, that's crazy. And we're going to have to talk about ROG years now.
For me, if it's 2 weeks ago and I have this thing, then I'll usually try and rewrite it, realize I did it for a reason, and then revert and add a comment.
Right. Yeah, sure.
That does happen to me.
I know this looks stupid, but it's the right way to go.
Yeah. This may seem crazy, but here's the reason why it's done this way. Yeah, for sure. And that's what comments are for, right? Is to let yourself know what's going on.
Future self.
I'm not stupid.
Was aware that this is dumb. Here's why.
Totally. I do that all the time. I think that's hilarious. But there are some other improvements in here too, right? So there are some, I want to know why you decided to add the DD tag. So Craft has always had this dump command that if you're in dev mode, you could dump a variable and see what is in there. And then you added the DD tag, which I guess is analogous to the PHP Craft DD, but why an extra tag? What's it for?
It's an alias for that.
Because Laravel did it.
Did Laravel? Do they have a templating thing? The original Craft DD PHP function was inspired by Laravel for sure. Right. Someone posted a GitHub issue saying, "Hey, I use this in Laravel all the time. Can I have it here?" For Twig, so you're right. There's always been the dump tag.
Right.
The dump tag only works in dev mode, first of all.
Right.
Because it's supplied by Twig's debug extension, which they recommend only running in development environments. So we just said, okay, fine. We'll check to make sure dev mode's enabled first, and then we'll go ahead and register this extension.
Mm-hmm.
But the main reason we added it wasn't so you could start using DD in production, because we also don't think that would be a good idea. It was because a recent Twig update started outputting all rendered templates into an output buffer.
OB start.
And then only once the template is done being rendered does it clear the output buffer and return the results. And I guess this was a way to ensure that, for example, headers don't get sent before they were expected to and stuff like that. And
that seems like kind of a major change.
Yeah, and that's fine, but someone was bit by this change because they were using the dump tag followed by an exit tag as kind of a dump and die,
Yeah.
within their Twig templates. And that wasn't possible anymore because, now this exit tag comes that throws basically throws like a 404 exception or whatever. Yep. And the error handling for that never clears the output buffer and outputs it. It just kind of lets the output buffer get, become deleted. So first of all, we needed to update the dump and die, the craftdd function, to ensure that all output buffers have been cleared. And then secondly, make that accessible from Twig with this new DD function. It's kind of a way to continue doing the same thing this guy was doing in a more precise, concise way.
So what happens if I do use the DD tag in production? Because I can think of two behaviors, and I can think of sometimes I might want one and sometimes I might want the other. So what happens?
It just does it. It doesn't care whether you're in dev mode or not.
Okay. Yeah, I mean, I could also think of cases where maybe I would want it to automatically not, but then that's kind of sloppy in some ways too,
We could add a DD if dev function.
DD if dev, yeah. Hey, for little things like this, you can just say, all right, we'll add a config setting. Do whatever you want.
Yeah, I mean, I guess, the long-term solution would be things like your IDE should be able to warn you about usage of this. Like PHP Storm. I don't know if it's the default PHP Storm functionality or if it's thanks to the PHP inspections plugin. But either way, at least for me, if I've got an exit call or a die call somewhere in my code, I actually get a big warning about it. I think they might even treat it as an error level warning.
Yeah.
Just as a reminder, this should not stick around in your code for long kind of thing. And I feel like that would be, something that maybe could be extended to the DD tag or even calls to the craftdd function.
So we've also got another templating improvement that I know a number of people were excited about, and it comes from, it's a PR, I think, from Tim Kelty, right? The attribute command, attr. Yeah.
Method. Yeah, that's a cool one. That I actually wasn't familiar with that helper method up until the PR, but it's a really cool function. We, eventually might comb through the Craft control panel code and see if we could start using that anywhere.
Yeah.
Yeah, I can think with Tailwind and a whole bunch of other ways where you have a bunch of classes you want to load in. For anyone who hasn't taken a look yet, and I don't think it's in the documentation yet, so maybe we'll link to the...
It's there, but it's light. But
yeah, we can either link to that or to the pull request that he had sent in, but it's terrific. You can set a Twig object, and then everything that would normally be an HTML attribute, your classes, styles, data tags, and everything, you can package it all up into a Twig tag, use true or false as to whether or not it should be exposed, and then you can just output that all into your div all in one line with
it's really clever because there's certain HTML is such a loose markup language, so there's some attributes where you don't even give them a value, like disabled or whatever, and then there's all the data attributes which if I were writing this thing, I probably would have just expected that if you have data attributes, you just need to add them as properties that are data dash whatever. But they've gone above and beyond, and this helper actually you can pass in just a data array, like a key that's an array or an object called data, and just have a bunch of key value pairs inside them, and then they'll all just get combined into each unique data dash foo, data dash bar attribute, which is really cool. And then whether the value is Boolean, if the value is Boolean and false, then it just doesn't show up, I think. If it's Boolean and true, then it'll get added as an attribute that doesn't have a value. And if it's set to anything besides a bool, then it'll set it to, attribute equals value kind of thing. So really cool.
Yeah, it's definitely one where people look and it looks like a really small thing. It's just one filter, but I think it could change a lot of how people template.
Yeah, for sure. So, I mean, for anyone that's not familiar with this, it's attr it's a function called attr. So, and you just pass in an object from there.
And I was familiar with this just because of some of the plumbing that I've been doing in the Ye helper stuff for the various HTML helpers and stuff. And I never had thought about using it in Twig. But I mean, you're right. It ends up being super helpful. It ends up being really nice and simplifies a lot of your code and gets rid of a lot of nonsense. But hey, do you remember Google? I don't even know if they still have it, but when you would search for stuff, there would be an I'm feeling lucky button.
Yeah.
Is that still there? Is that still a thing?
No, because now whenever you start typing in the search, you're immediately taken to results as you're typing.
Yeah, that's a bummer. Well, Brandon, this is a are you feeling lucky kind of thing, because what I'm going to do, I'm starting it now. I'm just the devMode.fm website. I've bumped up the Semver to Craft 3.2.0, and I'm doing it. Like, I'm doing it live. Okay. I'm doing it live. We're updating this thing to 3.2 live, and then I'm just going to blindly push it to production without testing anything.
On the call right now, huh?
On the call. All right. So
I would say this is my experience so far. If you have plugins that deal with drafts or live preview, you may want to take a pause. But otherwise, this is a pretty clean update so far as I've seen. 3.1 had a lot more. Yeah, with like project config had a lot more under the hood changing. But
it's a pretty safe update. We've already bumped craftcms.com up to it. No issues there. Yeah, I mean, like, I think, like Verb workflow would be an example. If you're using that, you might want to hold off. I'm not sure if they've released an update yet or not.
There's some issues with Neo. I heard some people talking about some issues with Neo.
Okay.
No. Site duplicate is one.
I can confirm Supertable's fine because we used that and we haven't had any issues and ended up testing that a bit during the beta process anyways.
Yep.
Yeah, we found site duplicate, which lets you kind of clone an entry from one site into another if they're not already propagating. Yeah, that relies on some revision stuff. So I think anything that relies on revisions, there's a possibility, but if it's
worth
definitely yep.
Well, I am not going to do that. And everyone who's listening, like, please don't do this at home because it's stupid. Like, don't do it. But it has finished. So it went through the whole thing, and everything looks like it's updated. And
did it deploy? Did you do it right on the server?
I haven't deployed it yet. All right, version 3. What? Craft 3.2.0. Oh, here we go. Here comes the commit, and here comes the push. And good luck, everybody. Okay, it's pushed. The CI stuff is going to do its deployment. Okay, so
Wednesday afternoon, yeah.
Yep. So devMode is now running Craft 3.2 in one fashion or another. It may be there may be an error up there. I have no idea.
Maybe a generous word.
All right. Well, let's see what happens. No. Oh my goodness. Oh my goodness.
503. No.
All right, hold on. Let's just make sure.
That's for compelling radio.
Yeah, I know. I know. I just had to do it. Oh, no. Okay, we're good. Like, we're up and running Craft 3.2, and I see no issues. Like, everything loads, everything works. We're good to go. So for anyone, and I literally did not test any of this. I will admit that in my own testing, I do have a test environment for Craft 3.2, and I've done plugin testing and stuff like that all along. So I was reasonably confident that we'd be okay.
I see what you're doing here, Andrew. Is you're setting us up. This is actually a very clever segue into the feature of Craft 3.2 that I'm most excited about.
Nerd.
And what is the feature of Craft 3.2 that you are most excited about, Michael?
Well, it would be the new testing framework, of course.
Okay. So for anyone who's not, let's talk about to people who are not familiar with this kind of testing stuff. And let's start from why would we do this? So Brandon, why would we implement testing at all?
For your own sanity, I guess. Like, it's nice to know as you're working on things that you're not breaking other things.
Right.
And it's much better to find out about that from an automated test that gets run than a customer or a site visitor that is hit by a bug later on.
Yeah, and Michael is exactly correct. Like, part of the reason for me doing this YOLO deploy kind of thing is that if I did have a CI tool set up that leveraged the testing that is now available in Craft 3.2, it would have been in that pipeline. It would have tested it, right? And it never would have deployed it. It never would have even gotten to deployment in that case, right? And we could have tests to make sure that, certain text appears on certain pages and all that kind of stuff. And
there's testing is kind of a big word, but there's unit testing and integration testing and we're using a library called Codeception, which is kind of all of the above. And we've got a fair number of unit tests written at this point and some integration tests in place as well, which basically spin up like a WebKit view, headless WebKit or something like that, and click around, verify that they're getting the responses they're looking for and stuff like that.
Yeah, so for people that have never heard of or done any kind of testing, so there are a couple different layers that I think you might consider. And one is just you can have just a test environment so that it will spin up Craft, and if something just plain doesn't work, like, it will halt the deployment. right? So that's a very basic, you're not really doing anything other than, making sure that the thing runs. But then, as you mentioned, you can do integration testing and acceptance testing and stuff where someone can make sure that certain things appear on the page and that if a certain thing is clicked on, something actually happens. So for websites that are critical in that matter, you can build these tests out and you can run them automatically when you do a deploy, and you can feel really comfortable that it's going to work because the deployment just won't even happen until that deploy has happened. And that test has happened and it's passed. And then there's another aspect to this, which is something that, we did a plugin developer cabal talk on here a while ago. And
can't speak about the cabal.
And a lot of us mentioned, we're not really doing that much with testing because we really want Craft to give us a test bed for doing this. Now here we are, right?
Yeah, here we are. We've got a full testing framework built into Craft. We've got example tests written within the code base that would mostly be applicable to plugins. But then we've also got a new tests/setup controller action, console command action that you can run on a per project basis to actually create a basic testing framework for your Craft project. And so you can actually be testing your project as well, in addition to using the code bases that have been tested. So it's pretty cool. And we've, there's documentation on it to kind of get you started. And then there's also, if you're going to get into it, there's a new testing channel within the Craft Discord server at craftcms.com/discord that you can get in and ask questions and get help as, we as a community are all kind of starting to embark on this journey into test-driven development and whatnot.
Yeah. And I've been working with, I'm probably going to pronounce his name wrong. Gil? Okay.
Yeah.
I want to say I've been working with Gil, but I really haven't. Like, he's been doing the work. Like, I haven't been doing anything.
He's amazing. I mean, he's out of South Africa, and he did 90% of the testing work in Craft 3.2. And yeah, did a great job. He's continuing to, as soon as he kind of wrapped that up, and he moved on to implementing other random pull requests, addressing other issues that haven't even made it in yet. Like by the time he started getting into this, we were already in the RC phase, so it's just too late to get anything into 3.2.
Right.
But within the next week or two, we'll probably get an alpha 1 of Craft 3.3 out with half of the features in there being his own work. So he's been an amazing contributor for the Craft community.
Yeah,
in the last few months.
That's fantastic. So I mean, what he's been doing is we had a little bit of a discussion about this, and he has been working on a pull request for Plugin Factory, so that when you generate a new plugin, you're going to get tests like built in, like a little scaffolding, so that people who've never done this stuff before, like at least here's a little bit of a starter thing in terms of like, okay, here's how you might set up these various tests to do it, which I think is absolutely fantastic. And then the other thing that I should mention is that Ryan Ireland has also done a tutorial video on creating your first test in Craft CMS over on CraftQuest. So I think that's pretty cool too. I mean, all these education materials are super important when you're getting people up to speed on something that, maybe they've never really done much with it before, as a web developer. But the Codeception tests, I mean, they allow you to do a decent bit of what you would do in a tool like Selenium, or God, I can't remember the name of it. There's another tool that allows you to do this kind of stuff where pages will actually render and it will look at what's on the page, and you can simulate clicking on it, and you simulate typing stuff in and submitting forms and make sure that the correct result comes back and all that stuff. And it actually lets you do some pretty amazing stuff.
It's pretty cool for sure. And it, kind of replaces that manual component as well. Like if you're doing some basic clicking around anyways, you might as well just automate it. Do it once, write the automation script once, and then just sleep, know that that's going to run every time you do anything in the future.
Yeah, because just about any engineer would much rather, write a test that will do it automatically than randomly click around in a browser. You know what I mean?
Right.
Yeah, for sure. For sure. So what do we miss out on any of these other new features? I mean, honestly, I'm really impressed with a number of these quality of life improvements. So, I mean, there are other things in here like related element validation, right? So that if I have an asset and someone adds the asset in, but I required on that asset that it have alt text to it because I care about accessibility, people can't save that entry now, right?
Yeah, and that's one of those things, again, it's been like a long-term feature request, but like in our heads, we were overcomplicating it. We've been thinking like the way to solve this would be at the point of upload where, you can't actually upload something and have it be committed to become an asset element until it's met the validation criteria. And the solution there would have been some convoluted UI where you can't just drag files into Craft anymore. Now, you drag them and it opens up a modal window and it's like, stored as a temporary file somewhere until you've submitted the content and it's all validated. And then it goes ahead and uploads it to S3 or, commits it to become an asset, whatever it is.
Right.
That was kind of the thinking, behind like how we would potentially solve this one day. And who knows when we'd get around to that. It's not an easy challenge. So I think it was Chris Kennedy in Discord, had like an off the cuff idea one day, and it was just like, oh, we're idiots. Why didn't we think of this? Solve it. Who cares? Who cares if the asset is valid when it's just sitting in the assets thing? The only time you really care if it's valid or not, and meets all the required field rules and all that kind of stuff, is when it's actually being used in the context of an entry. So why not do this validation as part of the broader entry validation? And once he suggested that, it's like, oh my gosh, we could knock this out in an hour and be done with it. So
yeah, so it's like a recursive validation, right? So basically, when you're validating the entry, if it's a related thing, then you validate that whole thing. Is that how it kind of works?
Yeah, exactly. Yeah. It's just the assets field or whatever. It works across all relational fields, but obviously the majority of the time you're going to want it with assets because those are the things that aren't necessarily valid to begin with. But so the assets field, for example, would just register a new validation rule on the parent element, whatever that is, saying, when you're ready to validate the entry, we'll just we'll load the assets that are related and ensure they're validated. If they're not, we'll register a validation error on the entry. And then the only complicated thing that came out of it after we initially released it was someone pointed out this could trigger an infinite loop if there was some kind of circular validation going on.
Sure.
Where that related asset or whatever it is was related to some other entry that was related back to the current one or whatever it was, and if all of them were invalid or actually even if they weren't, even if they validated, like you still had to find out whether they were validated or not. And to do that, it had to find out if the other thing was validated. So it kind of creates this like circular infinite loop thing. So we did have to add a little bit of code complexity to ensure, to keep track of which elements are already being validated by this thing and not double up on it. But
build a CMS, they said. It'll be easy. Yeah,
exactly. But overall, it's a drastically simpler solution than what we would have come up with, had we been given enough time to get around to it.
It reminds me of and I was surprised that this didn't exist because E2 comes with a number of really nice core validators. But I ended up writing a embedded model validator because I needed it for some plugin or something that I was doing where as it was validating the attributes of some model, if one of the attributes had a thing in it that was an instance of a model, it would then validate that, and go down through it. Mm-hmm. I didn't do anything to address any kind of possible recursion or infinite loop issue in there. So you definitely did.
Yeah, well, and I think most of the time, if you're talking about validating like a direct like attribute, by the way, of
attribute. Yes. That is a wonderful attribute that you have.
I volunteer as a tribute.
Mm-hmm.
Sorry, go ahead. Go ahead.
I try. I like the user impersonation feature. I don't think we've talked about that yet. I could see that.
Well, that's always been there, but we've opened it up to non-admins now.
Yeah, exactly. So one use case I have in mind, and tell me if this is possible, is you have an e-commerce site and maybe you have e-commerce admins who you don't want touching content. So they're in a user group that gives them access to commerce and nothing else, but they may need to log in as a customer or some other user. This now maybe even... And maybe even, I don't know if this is kosher, but even you could take an order for someone and log in as them if they have an account and do it over the phone. In lieu of, at some point, I think there will be the ability to create an order right from the dashboard. But this is one that I think people are going to find a number of different uses for.
Yeah, I mean, the only thing, like I gotta say, is you gotta consider customer privacy. So you shouldn't be just throwing this permission around all over the place. But but certainly there's cases where that would make sense. One thing we were concerned about, and is the reason we haven't added it until now, is is that like it could potentially be a way to escalate your own user permissions if you were to be able to impersonate another user that is an admin or has permissions that you don't have. So we did add a check. And so even if you have the impersonate user permission, you're not going to be able to use it for users that have better permissions than you do. So you won't be able to impersonate an admin user, and you won't be able to impersonate anyone that's, part of a user group or directly has permissions that you don't have access to. That's the one caveat. But certainly in the scenario you brought up where you've got, customers that theoretically have zero permissions associated with them. Certainly if you had the impersonate user permission, that would be enough.
Cool.
I did have one thing I wanted to mention about the whole validating related element validation that you have in there. It got me thinking, like, could you potentially then add a validation rule somehow that the image has to be at least this size, or it can't be bigger than this amount, or is that just not going to happen for this type of iteration?
There's already versions of that in the assets field. Like you can say that the assets field is only allowed to load images, for example, or to relay images, and that's both enforced in the UI as well as the backend validation. So we could certainly add to that, if you've already selected images or whatever, if it's an image that's selected, ensure that it's, a certain size. I guess, I don't know what the use case for that would be, because theoretically, whatever the size is, I guess maybe minimum image size would make sense.
Right.
Maximum wouldn't really make sense, because you can always transform them back down.
Well, there are a couple of cases where you might actually want to do it. So it's more like client proofing type of thing. So one is, as you mentioned, obviously, having a minimum size so they don't upload like a thumbnail version of something and then it's upscaled, then it looks terrible.
It's blown up to, yeah.
But the other is if they upload like, a 10 gigabyte PSD file, right? And even if you do the transform, like your server can die attempting to even generate the transform to do that, And especially if you're using ImageMagick, right.
It gets kind of problematic, because ImageMagick can kind of like get itself into this infinite loop where it's just ends up like eating up the entirety of your server's memory and putting things on swap disks and stuff. And it's all handled as a separate process from PHP. So PHP's memory limits won't have any effect on it.
Right.
So that's definitely a valid point. Maybe in the future we'll all just be moving all this logic over to, AWS anyways though. So we'll see. Yeah.
Anyway, I think that right. So the AWS serverless image handler type of stuff I did the article on, like, it's pretty cool. It's pretty wild. But there definitely are cases where things need to be done locally. And the fact that you're able to validate these things, these related things that are added, it just got me thinking that, there might be cases where in an entry, you might add some requirements about the related entry. You know what I mean? In specific cases and for assets, image size obviously comes to mind. Anyway, I just wanted to mention that.
Yeah, it's good. Good idea. I will say at some point in the relatively near future, we want to add condition builders to Craft. Add like a condition builder library,
right?
And then implement that on relational fields. So you would be able to start kind of building your own conditions rather than like it just being another couple of fields that everyone has to select. Like we could start adding. You just click another plus button and choose a drop down saying like image width, and then say drop down 2 is greater than, and text box 3 is 300, whatever it is. Like,
got it.
Moving to kind of more of a free form, build your own validation rules and conditions on what sort of elements are going to be selectable from these relational fields is kind of the direction we're taking them. And that's going to work across all entry types for sure. Like element types for sure. Like that's how eventually people have been asking for the ability to restrict entries fields to just one entry type, for example. Rather than just by section, they also want to say by entry type. And so adding like a condition builder where they could just add their own, where entry type is this or is not that, The problem is it's just like without adding a full blown condition builder, it's just such a can of worms. You got, There's always more things people will want. So it makes sense to just give them everything in a way that doesn't annoy everyone.
Right. Right. Yeah, and it sounds like this would tie in really well with conditional fields, and that people are able to add conditions to, what fields appear when, and then you would have conditional content, for in order to, the content must meet these specifications before it can appear. And you're right, you just give them this generic stuff and you say, go nuts.
And then we're going to, I mean, there's a million use cases for it. We want to use it for automation type support. We want to use it for element indexes. You could kind of create smart sources of, based on elements that meet specific criteria and things
testing.
like that. So.
And testing. Like if you're adding requirements for a given field, like you can then test to ensure all the content, meets those requirements.
Meets that criteria. Yeah.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. Really cool. Well, Brandon, this has been fantastic having you on here. Just want to make sure Patrick or Michael don't have any last minute questions that they want to ask you about Craft CMS 3.2.
Yeah, it's a cool release. I've only played around with it a little bit. I didn't participate in the beta as much as I probably should have. But just starting to edit an entry and seeing that little autosave working is really cool. And yeah, it's a pretty easy upgrade. Definitely, try it in your development build first, but this is not a one I think to wait too long on if you're the type.
It's a pretty, assuming you've got, as you said, assuming you have plugins that are dealing with, entry revisions and drafts or live preview, those are areas where you'd want to check with the plugin developer first or wait until you've seen a compatibility release from them. But yeah, it's awesome. It's like, not to toot my own horn, but like that's the reason that Craft CMS is already on 3.2 is because I had to write that stupid blog post yesterday in Craft 3.0. We hadn't even updated 3.1 yet, but I couldn't like after testing the new entry page for so long in 3.2, I just couldn't even bear to look at it anymore.
That's so funny.
And you're not pausing. I was on the repo and I already see there's a 3.3 branch out there. Yeah.
Well, there's nothing on that yet, but there will be there will be a PR to that in the next day or so.
Cool.
Well, this is why
he's ready to put in there.
This is why I love companies that dog food their stuff, because there's that annoyance factor. People that are dog fooding their own stuff, they're gonna find this thing that just annoys them, and they're gonna be like, God damn it! Like I'm just gonna fix this. You know what I mean? And
for sure. And the like a reverse example of that, I mentioned we were still on 3.0 and I wanted to move to 3.1 to get project.yaml in place because we had some changes we wanted to start making. And so while I was going through the hassle of, updating it for 3.2 yesterday, I figured, okay, I might as well enable project.yaml now and in preparation for doing some other site changes. And that I discovered a bug just from doing that. Like, it was where the changes in project.yaml weren't getting automatically synced because we were pushing them in, cases where there were no pending database migrations. And apparently we were only automatically syncing with the app/migrate command if there were database migrations available. So
if you haven't hosed your website at least once, with project config, you're not a Craft developer.
Oh man!
Well, it didn't host it. We have a staging server and discover things like because we're responsible developers. But
hold on. What are you saying, Brandon? You don't recommend doing what I just did and updating everything on a podcast?
I mean, for websites that no one visits, it's probably fine.
Ow!
Okay,
knives are going in deep.
It's not that no one visits; it's that they only visit
The AMP page. Yeah.
Oh, come on. This is what iTunes is for and all the podcast apps.
That about wraps it up for another episode of the devMode.fm
It's always good
podcast.
to have on our most frequent guest, Brandon Kelly. Thank you, Brandon. Yeah.
I think I'm giving up podcasting and becoming a goat herder in Montana. But in the meantime, to have every episode delivered to your favorite podcast player, subscribe to our RSS or subscribe via iTunes or Google Play. And if
you don't even list devMode.fm there.
Huh? Oh man.
You didn't even list your website there in this.
No. I do list it. I list it.
Heading to it.
You're too
Everything's
eager.
going headless.
You're over eager. You can follow us on Twitter at devModeFM. We'd love to hear your thoughts on this episode. Brandon Kelly, leave us a comment on the devMode.fm website for the devMode.fm podcast. I'm Andrew Welch.
I'm Patrick Harrington.
I'm Michael Rogg.
Brandon Kelly from Pixel and Tonic. Thanks for coming on.
Thanks, Brandon.
Sure thing.
Thanks.
I'm going to go cry myself to sleep. Brandon, my hat's off to you. That was amazing.
It's okay, Andrew, because no one's going to hear, as you know, no one listens to the end.
At the end, I know. But that was an amazing dig. Like that. That was beautiful. That was a work of art. I definitely appreciate that. All right.